So we're going to start with a little discussion. I'd love to have a round of applause for the wonderful artists and their presentations. It's really an honor to be here amongst you. You're all very gifted and inspiring, and I think that we're going to have a wonderful time, and we're going to have a little panel discussion, and that will be followed by Q&A, so everyone can get a chance to be part of this conversation. I think it's very interesting. We've sort of gone a little bit of the gamut from Bill, your early work, and then to Sakia Gunn, and this sort of tragedy, and then to this sort of landmark marriage equality that's currently being fulfilled in so many states, and to your very poignant experience. I guess one of the first questions I just actually want to throw out here with the complication of all these multi-identities and the intersection of race and gender and sexuality, and how you're able to prioritize what is important in your work, and sort of, if you could briefly talk about that space in which being of difference and being in a space that's black, and perhaps being different in sexuality, being in a space that's lesbian or gay, and how all these factors sort of intersect and influence your work. Let's start with Bill.
I am reminded of I was on a tour, and a lovely woman from a magazine, a European magazine, came to the hotel to interview me, and she was Dutch, and she said to me very early on in the conversation, "How do you identify, as black or as gay?" And I guess I was feeling a little flippant. I said, "What did you see when you walked in the door?" And she said, "Well, black, I guess." And I said, "Well, that's how I identify." And I think that is my strongest identification, is as an African American man. I don't have a lot of experience in other countries, so my experience is identified mostly with the United States. And after that, I identify as a gay man. And it's interesting because I think first I identified as a gay child. I first probably identified as a sissy, since that's what I was being called. And after that, a fag. And it took a long time to be politicized at all before I heard any of the correct terminology, that what we now deem as correct. So I knew I was different, and I knew I was always writing, I was always the kid with the yellow pad, and writing about being different, and writing about thinking that so-and-so is a beautiful man. And thinking that that was okay, even though I wasn't going to share that particular story with anyone, but loved writing about whoever the protagonist was that was so beautiful. And I think I put it together slowly, but certainly my consciousness, and I alluded to that earlier, about being black in America, was something that came up very early on in my family. My mother was very much about the brightest and the best, always. And at a certain point, it literally became like a chain around my neck. But certainly, you know, all of those things have been integrated to some extent in the work, but absolutely, first and foremost, I'm a black American.
Thank you, Bill. I'd like to throw the same question to you, Linnell, and additionally, you also have this background as a Haitian the, the issue of language, which you use so beautifully, and also love and desire, which seems to be a potent force in your work. Yeah.
I feel like I've always really resisted compartmentalizing my identity markers, and part of that is because I'm an immigrant, and I think I was always aware from a really early age that I could pass for things, that I could pass for African American even though I was Haitian born, that I could pass for, you know, a girl with desire for boys, because I wore skirts, even though I had different, you know. So I just, you know, and even as I became more and more of a poet, you know, people saying, well, you talk white, right? So I feel like just that awareness of what people put on you and what your position actually is made me really flexible about how I talk about my identity. That said, I think my primary identity is that of a poet. I identify primarily as a poet, as somebody who uses language to shape life.
Thank you.
Yeah?
And I guess, Thomas, I'm going to ask you to answer that question as well. And interestingly, there's been a lot of mention in the work of family, and maybe you could bring that into your answer as well.
Yeah, I would say that I would identify primarily as an activist, artist. You know, I grew up in a family that where, like, similar to Bill on one side in terms of the you know, affirmation of legacy of being both African American, but also part of an African diaspora, and having, like, being really rooted in history. And then on the other side, on my stepfather's side, it was really it was the space of exile, and also kind of being an immigrant. And he was from South Africa, and so we also grew up partly in Tanzania, and I moved there when I was 10. So it was like the heat of the, you know, the Pan-Africanist movement. You know, I was given the choice of going to an international school or going to a national school. Ooh. You know, and we were my brother and I were the only American, quote unquote, Americans in that school. And so, you know, I just was really aware that we had to fight for our freedom, and that we come from that legacy, and that is something that is just, I mean, it's just, you know, it's in some ways it feels a little like a burden, but I think any identity in, you know, many ways feels like a burden. You know, I think that because I moved there at such a young age, it made me think about things differently in terms of race, and it was also, you know, maybe because I was an adolescent, it was you know, I was in an all-boys class, so there was a lot of affection and physicality between boys and, you know, boys and young men, and so, you know, I was introduced to ways of being with men that you know, when I got back to this country, became very taboo, and so then I realized there were certain things you had to hide. Ooh. You know, and so, you know, I mean, I do feel like you know, I mean, when I'm in this country, there is a foregrounding of. It depends on what space I'm in. You know, in the city, I mean, it depends on the location. You know, in terms of, as people are saying, but I do feel like in terms of my motivation, my purpose in life, you know, is to create and to affirm and to yeah, that's very much part of it.
I remember your film, was Mikara?
Miyakara.
Miyakara, which is a wonderful film. I encourage everyone to see it if you haven't, in which you sort of, you're in Brazil and you're seeing images of yourself in other men, and the beautiful sort of poetry of that film, and how affirming that film seems to be how you're exploring and affirming who you are as a man, as a black man, as a gay black man. And I guess I think that so much of all of your work sort of provides a sanctuary for this multiplicity of identities. And I guess I'd like to ask you how you had the courage to come to these places in your work and your creativity, and who might be the early influences that gave you permission, or that you might have looked to for inspiration.
I want to take a step backwards, because originally, as I understood it, you were talking about identification. Now, I definitely identify as a black man. The motivation to create art is absolutely first and foremost. But as I move through the world, my identification is that. So I heard you say that, and I wish that I could feel that I was first and foremost an artist. I don't. But my motivation certainly is to create art. So I wanted to back up. Yeah.
So, do you also, when you're in answering, think about these questions, I guess I'd also ask how you, in this motivation, also see your work, or your ambitions for your work to also provide an opening of these sort of narrow categories, because I think art is the great force that sort of goes beyond these categories that are actually really part of who we are as artists and as LGBT people. How do you want to harness, again, who your influences are, and how you want your work to affect others, both in the black gay and outside of the black gay communities?
Somebody said, use the word freeing, and I think that is, for me, art has been freeing at my earliest, so that when I was feeling pretty isolated, pretty downtrodden as a kid, the other, I was so grateful. My mom got me a set of, I don't know that they exist anymore, Childcraft, it was called, a series of books. And I think I must have read those from cover to cover over and over and over again, because they allowed me an escape, and they allowed me to see beyond the four walls that were there, beyond the tumultuous situation that I grew up in. And so what I try to do, what I'm always, I think, aware of, is whoever the reader is who may also be sensing a vision beyond where they are. I'm always writing for the other, because I identify so much with the other on so many different levels. And I've been writing a lot for young people recently, and that's very special for me, because I so identify with that kid who is saying, I don't know where I fit in here. You know, and unfortunately, you read the statistics of people who decide, rather than to fight it out, not to be here. And I'm very, very sensitized to that.
I want to turn this to you, Linnell, for a moment.
Yeah, I was a really shy kid, and I wasn't allowed to play outdoors because we lived in the projects of Cambridge, Massachusetts, that nobody really likes to talk about. And you know, it was a rough neighborhood, and I couldn't go outside. So I would make up characters and talk to myself and play with them. And then in the 6th grade, I discovered this thing called theater, where people did that all the time. And I learned social skills, really, through practicing theater. And I learned this really amazing thing about embodying the other, right? That's what theater's about. It's about putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and really trying to tell the story of their perspective, right? And so all of my formal training is in the theater. I'm a poet by calling, but certainly, you know, I write plays too, and I'm always really interested in being as specific as possible with the characters. My poems are, you know, they tend to be, you know, autobiographical and sort of rooted in a you know, in what I know, right? But when I write plays, it's usually a debate that I'm having with myself and with the world, you know, and really trying to see the other position in a way that is compassionate and full, so that I don't just go, oh, you think differently than I do, so forget you, you know, but that I go, oh, you think differently, and I really want to get inside of that place. And so I write plays about racists who are also great mothers, and you know, fiercely intelligent authors who are also carnal creatures, you know, and I'm interested in those contradictions. They help me to be more compassionate as a person. You know, Lorraine Hansberry, one of my influences, you know, when she wrote A Raisin in the Sun and it became so successful, was often told that she was not writing a black play. That the you know, A Raisin in the Sun was so universal, and you know, she would respond to that with, you know, she wouldn't necessarily show that she was offended, but you know, you could tell that she was, and she would say, you know, well, I'm writing you know, I'm writing with specificity. And that specificity makes it accessible, right? I'm writing
That's
about
right.
Chicago and the South Side and this black family and this particular man. And that is what, you know, portraying his full humanity in his location is what helps an audience into it. And, you know, I'm just gonna I'm gonna do my 2013 remix a little bit on that. Like, this is not a black play idea, or this is not black work because it's universal, is really about somebody saying, I did not expect to feel empathy when I saw your black lesbian work. I expected to feel guilt. You know, and because you have employed the tools of Western literature, I'm shocked, right, that you even know how to do that, and also that was a choice that you made to tell a very specific story. So I think, you know, I mean, again, I'm just always I'm always interested in those tensions, and I think that tension comes through form and through content.
Yes, yes, very, very good point. I guess, and Audre Lorde, when she did her book Zami, you're spelling my name, coined the word automythology.
Biomythology.
Yes.
It's not the same thing.
Which gave her permission, because all the characters in that book are thinly veiled people. There are two characters in that book that are my parents, for instance. So Jean and Alfred, Joan and Al. But it gave her the permission to tell the story she needed to tell without it being limited in form and without alienating everyone